Welcome back to Turning Hard Times into Good Times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again Gene Epstein, who usually joins me in the first Tuesday of each month as he heads up a wonderful event in New York City at the General Society Library, 20 West 44th Street, and that is called the New York City Junto Meetings. They're an excellent event, an excellent forum. And Gene heads it up and has done a remarkably great job of making that a very, very valuable time, 2-3 hours or so that are spent there with some great guests. And this week's guest, this month's guest, I should say, is Tyler Cohen. He's a professor of economics at George Mason University. And so I want to welcome Gene. Thank you, Gene, for joining me again.
Sure. I'm happy to be back.
Thank you, Gene. So listen, tell us a little bit before we get to your what I want to talk to you today about. I want to talk to you about a presentation you made in Japan called Japan, the U.S., and the Challenge of Demographics. But before we get to that, just very briefly, if you could tell our listeners a little bit about Tyler Cohen and what he might talk to the New York City Junto group about this coming Thursday.
Well, Tyler is as you mentioned, economist at George Mason. He does a very active and popular blog, and he's a prolific writer, done a number of books. He's going to go over some of the ideas that he's propounded in his books. His most recent book was called Average is Over. It's an attempt to project the future, and then he's going to solicit questions and from the audience, and so essentially it's going to be an interactive evening, and Tyler is very fast on his feet, interesting, and very knowledgeable, so we're all looking forward to it.
Well, I'm looking forward to somebody that can give me some optimism here, Gene. Average is over, powering America beyond the age of the Great Stagnation. And I have to ask you, in light of your presentation in Japan, there is quite a mountain to climb, it would seem, to get over average, over that hill top called average. In your presentation, it was titled Japan, the U.S., and the Challenge of Debt and Demographics. In that presentation, you showed the cover page of Barron's that related to the article that you wrote for Barron's, the feature article several months back, Follow Me, We Can Be Like Greece. Can you summarize that article for our listeners, perhaps, and just tell us a little bit, what kind of response did you receive from some of the communist economists like Paul Krugman?
Oh, yes. Well, we're starting at the beginning then, an article that prompted my being invited to speak at the International House in Japan, a very prestigious place, and I was certainly flattered they asked me to speak in Japan about the issues that are going on in their country, because they are eerily parallel to what goes on in the U.S. I published a cover story, as you mentioned, that spoke about the potential for Obamanomics and for what essentially Obama stands for and what he's moving us in the direction of. Although for me to single out Obama is only in context, only because he's president now.
Sure.
I believe that George W. Bush, his predecessor, also moved us in that direction.
Sure.
And what was that? The direction of Greece. And what does Greece mean? Well, Greece clearly experienced a fiscal crisis because it could not pay off its debt. Now that rather incendiary analogy raised hackles of Paul Krugman, and I know some other prominent blogger whose name escapes me. He said that this was yellow journalism to even suggest that the U.S. economy could ever be like Greece. I wrote a response online pointing out that Krugman, as usual, probably had not bothered to read the article and probably just looked at the headline. Had he done so, he would have noticed that the analogy with Greece did not originate with me. I duly credited the analogy to the staid, non-partisan Congressional Budget Office, a very establishment organization that had written a paper, generated a paper from one of their economists pointing out that the fiscal crisis that was looming over the long term by the 2020s or 2030s for the U.S. could be similar to the fiscal crisis in Greece. So that's where the incendiary analogy came from. Again, if the Congressional Budget Office is worried, I think we should all be concerned about that sort of possibility.
Absolutely, and I guess Mr. Krugman picks and chooses who he decides to pay attention to and to revere. You know, Ian McAvity is on this show frequently, and he likes to talk about the United States. And speaking of demographics, is very quickly moving to a country in which more people vote for a living than work for a living. So I'd like to ask you, Gene, could you, I don't think we're going to have time, I know we're not going to have time to talk about everything I'd like to talk to you, hear about from you on Japan and the United States, but focused on the United States perhaps a little more than Japan.
Sure.
What can you tell our listeners about the demographics and what that's going to mean in terms of our economic future?
Well, work versus vote for a living is actually a very good way of putting it, and in fact, I think it has an even deeper meaning, which I'd love to elaborate on. But most specifically, of course, it means that the baby boomers, who are the oldest, is now 67, the youngest is about 49. They are going to reach critical mass by the 2020s, 2030s. They are beginning to retire and beginning to cash in on elder care entitlements that include Medicaid and Medicare especially. Social Security is actually a relative sideshow financially in that. Social Security is part of the problem, but the biggest problem is Medicare and Medicaid. And when they won't be working for a living, they will be indeed voting for a living, and they'll be voting for those entitlements, and that debt and demographic burden is what the Congressional Budget Office warns us about, that we could go by way of Greece. But I want to elaborate on one point. You know, it's actually Richard Epstein, who's a classical liberal legal scholar, who points out that essentially that problem of voting for a living rather than working for a living is inherent in the progressive income tax. That if there is a perception, and of course the perception reflects reality, that when you vote for entitlements, you don't pay for them. That when you vote for certain government programs, you don't pay for them. The rich pay for them. Then that creates a distortion in politics, and that's in fact the principal reason why Richard Epstein favors argues for a flat tax. Of course, a flat tax can have different meanings, but in that case, the flat tax simply means that everybody pays the same percentage, so that in everybody's perception, if you vote for something, you also end up having to pay your share of it. And I think that's a powerful argument that Richard Epstein, no relation, by the way, to me, has made. And so if that's part of the problem as well, but indeed, clearly, the baby boomers vote, older people tend to vote more than younger people, and that's going to create what, Lawrence Kartlakoff, for example, I'm hardly the only person who's pointed out these problems. Peter Peterson, by the way, has also been very eloquent about them. So I'm almost a Johnny-come-lately about the obvious demographic and debt time bomb that is threatening the U.S.
Well, certainly, and then, of course, when the burden falls on the rich, what you do is just another means of destruction of capital as well, I would imagine. But another thing, Gene, is that one thing that Ron Paul pointed out in the past, that, actually we wouldn't have to have any taxes at all because we can print infinite amounts of money, at least the United States can up to now. So what about that argument? I guess the flat tax makes sense, and actually Putin in Russia has a 17% flat tax. Looks awfully good to me.
Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, that free market activist, Mr. Putin. Indeed, that sort of irony can arise. I assume that Ron Paul meant that facetiously because, in fact, when I, among some, at least who did read my article, about analogizing it with U.S. with Greece, the critics, of course, were certainly right to say, well, if I'm picking up on the Congressional Budget Office analogy, I must also believe it, and therefore intellectually I'm responsible for it. They were right about that. But they pointed out that the difference between the U.S. and Greece is that Greece had to pay its debt in euros and could not print euros. But in our case, we got no problem. We have a debt denominated in dollars, and we can simply print dollars. So therefore, why compare us to Greece? We can just easily print our way out of the problem. That, of course, is a truly disastrous solution, as Ron Paul would be the first to recognize, that's
sure.
just pouring oil on the flame. That is another kind of partial default. That could truly start a panic. If foreigners who are holding foreign currencies, the Chinese, the Japanese, others, find that the U.S. is actively devaluing its own currency, and that means then that the debt that that the foreigners are holding in dollar denominations is collapsing in value. That could truly cause a panic if we resort to the printing press, as indeed we might.
Well, indeed, and of course, Gene, in our fractional reserve banking system, in our fiat monetary system, as opposed to a gold-backed system in which you actually have an asset-based money, we know that debt is the raw material from which money is created. So if you print more money in our current system, you're creating more debt. And as I look at charts of total debt in the United States relative to GDP, total debt is growing exponentially almost, and GDP is growing, if at all, 2%, something like that, right? So this would seem to be a disaster. So even you can't print your way out unless it doesn't seem like that's an easy, really a successful solution in the long run either.
Well, no, it's not going to be a successful solution, certainly, but it is indeed a solution. As a matter of fact, Alan Greenspan wrote in his memoir, The Age of Turbulence, published in early 2008, that he feared that by the time that inflation could go back to double digits by the late 2020s, early 2030s. It was the one good nugget in that book of his, by the way, in which he pointed out that the disinflationary forces that provided a disincentive to money printing, which is cheap labor all over the globe, that would probably be more than played out by the 2030s, and then the intergenerational transfer of elder care entitlements would explode, and the temptation to print money would be great, and there could indeed be a return to double-digit inflation. Greenspan, of course, didn't even know the half of it, because clearly it's not just double-digit price inflation that's the problem. It's the destabilization of our domestic and then consequently world economy that could result from that sort of action.
No doubt about it, and that's it's still with us today, Gene. I believe that we haven't really overcome the problems of 2008, 2009. You know, one of the interesting things I picked up from your PowerPoint presentation was you pointed out very rightly, I think, that there is a structural political flaw that gets in the way of fiscal responsibility on the part of our policymakers. Can you perhaps talk about that a little bit to our listeners?
Well, I think you're referring to what I cited as public choice theory, and
yes.
it's vital. It really is, of course, especially important for people to grasp it. It's, I think, one of the key pillars that progressives rely on. There are really two pillars they rely on, but one of them, of course, is the idea that the government consists of philosopher kings, and that if we have a few bad apples in government, George W. Bush is, of course, regarded as a bad guy. Then we have Obama coming along, or then we had Kennedy, where we had potentially Johnson. So there's always some philosopher king coming along who's going to do something responsible. But of course, there are wonderful people also in business. The difference between business and government is really that everyone in business, as well as in government, as the public choice theory people point out, operates out of a certain amount of healthy self-interest, and that's why it was Jim Buchanan, who was the principal designer of the public interest theory. That's why he called the progressives' view, called public interest theory, politics without romance. That it's politics without romance because it doesn't imagine that when people go into government, they suddenly become transformed into wonderful, selfless philosopher king human beings. They're just ordinary people. It's not that we necessarily say that Obama or George W. Bush or any of them are evil. Sometimes they do evil things, but we can leave that alone. It's just that they are politicians, and they clearly then are acting in their self-interest, and they're for that reason only have their idea on the short term. They want to spend. They want to glorify their own administrations, and of course, when the bill comes due, it will only be years after they leave office. That's
right.
why they will naturally act irresponsibly. In business, of course, certainly in a publicly traded corporation, if a CEO starts wasting money and piling up debt on the company's balance sheet, its stock will be instantly punished. And the CEO, of course, who probably owns stock options and who has a stake in keeping his job in any case, will feel the heat right away, because the mechanisms are in place to make sure that his self-interest is allied to the interests of the company. That doesn't happen on the level of government because there are only us taxpayers, and we can easily be confused. We're disorganized. We can't get together. We can't simply short the company's stock. There is no such thing because USA Inc. Does not trade publicly on any stock exchange.
Right. Well, Gene, I'm just thinking maybe that's one of the arguments for one-term elected officials instead of having,
really?
Looking for re-election and so forth. But anyway,
yeah.
The other thing I have to ask you about. Where does this all end? We only have a couple of minutes, but clearly what we're doing is printing more and more money faster and faster. It's creating, I think, a bigger problem. We have some relief, a little bit of economic growth perhaps, but very, very minuscule, because there are structural problems, I think, in the economy that are not allowing us to really grow as we once did. So how can we get over this hump with about 2 minutes left? How can we get over this hump? And the second is, who's worse off? And we didn't even have a chance to address Japan at all, but Japan has many of the same problems. Which country is worse off, Japan or the United States? And how can we get out of this mess, Gene, with 2 minutes?
Well, Japan is worse off because they're facing the problem right now, a problem the U.S. Will be facing in about 10 years. So they are worse off for that reason. As for how we get out of this mess, well, we've got a lot of messes. By the way, you conceded too much when you talked about a little bit of growth. Well, as you know, there was a contraction in the first quarter, which was quite disconcerting, of 2.9% annualized. Now, if you are correct, and I think you and I probably have a disagreement over the crystal ball. If you are correct that we're headed for financial disaster, as many have argued, whom I respect, that this is going to happen over the next 2 or 3 years, we probably won't get out of it. I'm more optimistic. I believe that we'll inch along with slower growth over the next decade or so, and then I believe that potentially certain radical forces might overtake what's sinking us down, and those radical forces would be, briefly, the free market revolution in medical care that is taking place in this country. Probably have no more time left. So,
well, unfortunately, we don't have much of any time left, but I would just say perhaps Tyler Cohen, professor of economics at George Mason, who will be speaking at the New York City Junto. Gene, you'll be heading that up again as you do such a remarkably good job. Maybe he'll have some more optimism for us along the lines you're just speaking of?
Yes, perhaps he will.
All right, well, let's hope so. And I want to thank you very much, Gene, for your time. I'm sorry to cut you short because I know you have so much more. Folks, if you come to the New York City Junto, if you live in the New York City area, you'll hear a lot of Gene's ideas and his wisdom, along with a lot of other folks that are there, and the key speakers that are always excellent. Thank you very much, Gene, for being with us.